Welcome. Welcome to the first online version of the Collective for Gender Plus in Research seminar series focusing on politics, policy, and the pandemic. As we reimagine our gatherings in light of COVID-19, we'd like to begin by acknowledging that the University of British Columbia, the host institution for this event, is being held on traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam and Coast Salish people. We recognize that the virtual meeting in this space means that you might be on different indigenous territories, and we welcome you to self-identify where you are located on the chat box at the bottom of your screens. And so to help facilitate this, we invite you to take a moment and head to this website, nativeland.ca, posted for you in the chat box. You can simply type the name of the city or town in which you are located and explore the various territories, languages, and treaties relevant to the land in which you sit. Now, who are we and why are we here? The Gender Plus in Research Collective works to promote a community for rich dialogue in which gender and other identity intersections, including but not limited to race, class, sexuality, ability, and indigeneity, are considered when doing research. The collective focuses on capacity building and providing the tools researchers need to consider and utilize a gender plus lens. We emerge out of conversations surrounding UBC's Women Deliver 2019 mobilizations as we build networks and connections from that initiative. We are students, researchers, and interested community members in all their variations, and you're all welcome to join us. So, hello from Vancouver in British Columbia, in the ancestral, traditional territory of the Musqueam people. For today's teach-in, we aim to discuss gender plus considerations during COVID-19. All our panelists will attend to the different ways COVID-19, its impacts on gender and intersections of sexuality, income, race, indigeneity, and numerous others important facets of identity and inclusion. Organized as a teach-in, this seminar will have each panelist speak for about 5 to 7 minutes on a topic relevant to gender plus and COVID-19, and then followed by a Q&A session towards the end. Written questions can be submitted by everyone during the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and then upvoted by you as attendees. So we will monitor the question and answer window and post questions using attendees' first names only. If you'd like to pose a question to a specific member of the panel, please indicate in your question. Please note as well that this webinar and the following Q&A session will be recorded, and by using this Zoom presentation, we are not asking you to use your camera or microphone to participate in the Q&A. Remember that after the presentation, the recording will be uploaded publicly by the Gender Plus Collective website with a link disseminated to all attendees. And the recording will not include the attendees' names. So welcome. I'm Nora, Lenore Angelis from the Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice Institute in the School of Community and Regional Planning at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And as a researcher myself, I am particularly intrigued by how intersectional experiences, identities, and innovations particularly around indigeneity, gender, race, class, citizenship, and nation, are magnified during a major global pandemic. Joining me today are Julia Smith, a research associate at Simon Fraser University's Faculty of Health Sciences. Welcome, Julia. Kim van der Woerd, principal of the indigenous consulting firm Reciprocal Consulting and faculty at Simon Fraser University, and an indigenous women's health advocate. Welcome, Kim. We have Tim Ag, current interim executive director of Qmunity, an LGBTQ2S organization based in Vancouver. Welcome, Tim. Katherine Scott, senior researcher and director of gender equality and policy work at the CCPA of the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives. And finally, we have Ellen Woodsworth, founder and co-chair of Women Transforming Cities and a former Vancouver City Councillor. Welcome to everyone. We will then start with Julia Smith. Her research center at SFU's Faculty of Health Sciences focus on the social, political, and commercial determinants of health. She holds a PhD from the University of Bradford in the United Kingdom and has 15+ years research experience in health and development projects in Canada, Africa, as well as in Europe. Julia is currently co-leading new research on how rapidly developing infectious disease outbreaks like COVID-19 impact gender. Please go ahead, Julia.
Thank you very much, and thank you, everyone. I'm going to try and share my screen here. And while I'm doing that, I want to acknowledge that I am joining you from the unceded territories of the Squamish Nation in the town of Squamish right now. And let's start this slideshow. Okay, so I am in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University, and I received a CAHR grant with other colleagues to study the gendered impacts of the COVID outbreak. So it includes myself at SFU, as well as a couple other professors there, as well as colleagues in the UK, Australia, and Hong Kong. And I'm going to go over this very fast because I assume most people on this call understand why gender-based analysis is important when we're looking at issues like COVID. But I just want to stress that we are trying to take an intersectional approach to gender analysis. So we're really trying a gender plus analysis that includes looking at how different groups are impacted by COVID and by the response to COVID, not just in terms of gender, but race, ethnicity, class, and other factors. And we're aiming to look beyond the binary, gender binaries around men and women to be inclusive. And that takes a slightly different shape depending on where we're doing our research. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the research project so you understand where I'm coming from. We're doing a case study here in Canada, as well as in the UK, Hong Kong, and China. And our really big and broad research question is, what are the gendered impacts of responses to COVID? So the important thing to focus on here is we're looking at the impacts of the response as opposed to the actual virus and disease. And then, of course, how can those be mitigated? And this is a qualitative research project, so we're talking to people on the front lines, those whose well-being has been affected economically or socially, as well as policymakers, to better understand their stories and experiences with COVID. I think some of the other presentations might present some very interesting quantitative analysis, some stats and that administrative data analysis, and which is really important. And we're trying to kind of also add this qualitative element of understanding how people are living through this very interesting time. We're also conducting social media analysis and policy analysis, including interviews with policymakers to understand if and where and how gender fits into their planning and response. So what I wanted to share with you today, very, very quickly, is this first sort of analytical framework that we've developed around gender and COVID. And we used a matrix framework developed from the WHO and other development organizations and partners to structure our questions, because our project is quite broad, to look at sort of the experiences of health crises like COVID, and then the gender domains. And these are the types of questions we're asking. So how is risk structured by access to resources? How is it structured by norms and belief, by power and decision making? And the same with, the experience of the COVID illness and treatment and of health services. So who has access to systems without fear? And I know there's too many words here right now for you to read them all, but I just kind of wanted to introduce this matrix framework. And this is the first half of the framework. The second half looks more at the social, and economic impacts. And we've included security impacts here because we recognize that COVID, or the response to COVID with the social isolation and the distancing measures in place, is having very important security impacts for different groups of people. And so I'm going to take you now to the website so you can see how we're putting this into practice. And what we've done is we are so far gathered data from our different case study countries. So if you go here to Canada, from research that's being done from the media, from government reports, to try and find evidence to fit into these domains to provide a very comprehensive analysis. So if you go to our website at some point, you can come here and see the different matrix for our case study countries. And if you click on them, you will find more examples that sort of fall into that category. So our aim here is to provide a very broad snapshot of the current gendered impacts of COVID in each of the case studies. And we will be supplementing this with our own research, or increasing the depth of it with our own research and further document research as we go on. We also have tools on our site about how you can adapt the gender analysis matrix to other specific populations or contexts. So if this is something that looks kind of interesting to you, we've got a lot of resources there. Oops, let's see. Why is it? It's not going ahead. 1 second. There you go. As I mentioned, we're also doing interviews with people who are affected, who are on the front lines. We are just in the midst of this now, so we have not comprehensively analyzed these transcripts yet. But I wanted to share some sort of like preliminary findings. One group of frontline workers we've been speaking to is early childhood educators. We're really trying to take a broad understanding of people on the front line, so not only healthcare workers, but also people that are providing childcare, people that are working in transition houses, and other folks. And what we really heard here in British Columbia from childcare educators so far is a lot of anxiety and confusion around policies initially when the crises hit, and now as things are starting to open up. There's also a real frustration around working conditions and a lack of recognition for their work they're doing. I think almost every ECE I spoke to said to me, nobody is clapping for us. When people go out at 7 o'clock and clap for health workers, they're not clapping for early childhood educators, and they feel very underappreciated and often not protected. We're also speaking to people who have, are disproportionately economically affected. And so, here's a quote from one woman I spoke to who was getting the CERBs, the government relief, but had, real challenges actually just going out and buying the things she needs, because she's a single mom with 2 kids and she doesn't want to take her kids shopping, and it's hard to find the supplies she needs. She has to go and stand in very long lines at multiple places, and this is causing great anxiety for her. And as somebody who doesn't have a lot of family around and has been through tough times, she's really, I could really telling a story of being absolutely terrified about if she were to get sick, who would take after her kids. So she wants to be very careful. And so these are the type of stories we're trying to collect to inform policymakers. And some of the very broad themes that we've got at this point, and like I said, we're in the preliminary stages of this research, is one, the double risk that women are facing in their employment. On the one hand, being at risk of contracting COVID because the majority of frontline workers are women, but also being at the greatest risk of losing income through loss of employment because of the sectors that are most affected, such as service and tourism industry, tend to be dominated by women employees. We're also hearing a lot about what I could then refer to as a triple risk among newcomers to Canada, who have many of those similar risks I just described, but also a real challenge in terms of accessing services and information, protective supplies. And then finally, this pandemic of anxiety and mental health challenges. And it's interesting, but there's surveys that have been done in all of our case study countries that really all say the same thing, that anxiety levels are highest amongst people who identify as women, that women are bearing a greater emotional and psychological burden during this epidemic. And that's one interesting point that I think is coming out of our different case studies, is that we're actually seeing very similar trends across them, where you might expect to have greater differences considering the diversity. But I think this is very much a globalized pandemic, and also it's exposing the globalization of gender inequities across our case studies. So I'm going to leave it there and just say thank you, and please get in touch if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia. I'll now turn over to Kim, but before we let her speak, I'd like to say a few more words about her. Kim is a member of the Namgis First Nation from Alert Bay in British Columbia, and the principal of Reciprocal Consulting, an Indigenous consulting firm that specializes in program evaluation and research. With over 20 years of experience conducting local, provincial, and national program evaluations, managing over 200 projects, Kim and her team at Reciprocal Consulting are passionate about social justice and culturally responsive research and evaluation. She completed her PhD in psychology at SFU and has also been active in serving many community organizations locally and nationally, and is a leading advocate for Indigenous women's health. So Kim, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Nora. And Gila Kasla, thank you to Gayleen and Nora for this opportunity to share some thoughts with you today. And just the whole organizing team for bringing everyone together for this teach-in. As Nora mentioned, I am a member of the Namgis Nation in Alert Bay, BC. I'm actually coming to you from the homelands of the Squamish people here in Vancouver. Very grateful to be here. I'm a member, I'm from the Shaughnessy and Wanik family. My grandmother gave me the name Gwalasian in our first family potlatch after the ban, and that comes from the Killer Whale clan. So as Nora mentioned, I am the founder of Reciprocal Consulting, and I was just thinking that today I would share a little bit about what we're hearing from Indigenous communities as we go through COVID-19. And I think I would normally ask for a show of hands of how many people are hearing really common terms like pivot, Zoom fatigue, COVID-15 for those of us who are baking bread for the first time, unprecedented. Unprecedented. I think we've heard that a lot. The fact is, this is precedented for Indigenous communities, what we're going through with this pandemic. We've been here before with purposeful and fatal spread of disease in the last couple of centuries. the feelings like Julia was mentioning about the anxiety and mental health concerns that we have right now, the feelings that we're having, that intense loneliness, the food insecurity, the lack of intimacy, the fear for our families, the fear for our safety. We've been here before. I think many of us are also seeing the world kind of being boiled down to the essentials. Again, echoing what Julia was saying with the frontline workers and what is really important for us right now. And the flaws in our system are more pronounced, and the disparities are more visible than what they've been before. So I want to bring in a quote from Cindy Blackstock, who said, "Contemporary colonialism is marked by making acceptable what would be appalling for any other group." And she brought that up in light of blowing up sacred burial sites to build pipelines and build walls between Mexico and the United States. And while I mentioned COVID is making visible what has been invisible, the issues and concerns you're hearing about have not been invisible for Indigenous communities. When we hear about lack of access to resources, we've typically been the last in line to receive supports. So everything that we've been advocating for now is even more pronounced. The overcrowded housing and the challenge for the self-isolating and quarantining, not enough resources going to our communities, including PPE. And then when you are experiencing any sort of mental health or other challenges, there's not enough Indigenous specific services where you actually can go and feel safe and get the help that you need. I mentioned this in a talk the other day that many of us have the luxury of a roof over our head and water to wash our hands with. We've been hearing again and again, wash your hands, wash your hands. And in over 100 communities in Canada, Indigenous communities, there's no running water and potable water. So it's important, as you all know, coming into this teach-in, that gendered lens is absolutely critical in the research that's happening with COVID. And Indigenous women are experiencing a pronounced level of violence and a lack of cultural safety in so many situations. In fact, it was also just announced yesterday that the report that the federal government was wanting to produce yesterday is delayed. In terms of acting on the calls to justice for the missing and murdered Indigenous women's inquiry. And some of the data that's going around this is that every 8 days an Indigenous woman is murdered or goes missing. So since Canada has been shuttered, that's 10 women that have gone murdered or missing. And are we hearing about this? So what our colleagues are talking about, in addition to the pandemic, Indigenous communities are existing within an infodemic where we're fighting against censorship, misinformation, no information, distortion, lies, all of like a lack of information and data. So our team has been speaking up about the need for disaggregated data on COVID-19 and beyond. With the technology and information pathways that we have now, our communities actually have the ability to prepare and protect ourselves during this pandemic, but we're lacking this information. It's just emerging this week with regard to funding allocation for surveillance and research for Indigenous communities that we're receiving 0.0003% of the health research dollars that are being spent. And that's without having the full denominator and access to the full denominator of how much is being spent on surveillance and research. So the 0.0003% is probably an overestimate of how much Indigenous communities are receiving. And without this data, there's a jurisdictional divide. So because the Indian Act we have in Canada, and the thinking of Indians being wards of the state, were being bounced back from provincial to federal jurisdictions where no one wants to assume any responsibility. Without data, it produces a fear of how to act, where to go, and then increasing stigma as a result. So what I'm hoping for is like a call to action and thinking about the data that we need. So it's so clear that we need a gendered lens, but for our communities, and I'm so glad the term intersectional is being used, for our communities, it's really hard to disaggregate a feminine response to COVID from a familial response to COVID. So the impact of colonialism can be so much more pronounced than the patriarchy. So continuing to uphold that intersectional approach is so important. And where we find hope, we've heard another term that we hear so much is about planking the curve. And I guess the other curve that we're also hearing about is with regard to climate change. And many have spoken about how our current capitalistic and destructive environmental practices are linked to COVID. And with globalism undermining our capitalistic practices and so forth, we have the opportunity to look to Indigenous people for their leadership on food sovereignty, conservation, and healing. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. I think your presentation and Julia really brought a lot of what intersectionality and the power of looking at indigeneity as a very important pillar in that intersection. And particularly the fact that this is not unprecedented for many Indigenous peoples, as well as people in the global South. Sorry. Hi, did I lose sometime there?
You were there, Nora, just your video wasn't on, but we heard you.
Okay, so I think the framework that Julia had given is important for us to keep in mind the importance of environment and the climate change impacts. So we'll now move on to our third speaker. Team Ag is the current interim executive director of Qmunity. As I mentioned earlier, it's a nonprofit organization based here in Vancouver, which works to improve queer, trans, and two-spirit lives. Tim was the executive director at PLEA, or PLE Community Service Society, for over 30 years, and has retired in 2016. Tim, you look so young to be a retiree, and was later appointed by the Minister of Social Development and Poverty Reduction to facilitate the Reimagining Community Inclusion Initiative, a stakeholder engagement process which created a 10-year roadmap for the development of supports and services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in British Columbia. Tim is also a board member of the former BC Human Rights Coalition, among other voluntary roles. So Tim, take it away.
Good morning, and I acknowledge that we gather on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and I thank the organizers for their kind invitation. Qmunity is BC's Queer Resource Center. My remarks today are inevitably rooted in service delivery and our response to the pandemic. I'm not blessed with being backed up by much in the way of research and data. I'd love to talk to some of my colleagues on this panel about how to fix that problem in the coming years. I joined Qmunity last fall. I also have some old history with the organization, having chaired its board for 3 years back in the 1980s. Back then, all work was done by volunteers, and we were propelled along by both commitment and argument. That's over 40 years of effort by the LGBTQ2S+ community to create for ourselves a safe and healthy space to deliver services, to support our peers, and to help advance our rights. We look across that history and we see wins and setbacks. We see external threats and internal fights. We see moments of anguish along with celebrations of progress. What we see across that history is our resilience. Late in 2019, Qmunity came through a difficult period that required the temporary closure of our programs. In February, we had just completed hiring for several vacancies, as well as an internal review of services, jobs, and policies, and we're just reopening programming. Then COVID-19 hit us. We suddenly had to close our offices to walk-ins and group programming and to work from home. In general, we know that many members of the queer community have suffered job loss and income insecurity, especially those in the restaurant, retail, and entertainment industries. We also see indications of stress, anxiety, and isolation resulting from the pandemic. We see women and families, in queer families, facing the same issues around isolation, childcare, and so forth that are experienced by other women. Those with chronic health conditions feel especially vulnerable. As I talk about our various service areas and our response to the pandemic, you will see how these impacts and others are showing up. First, we host the Butte Street Clinic, which is operated by the BC Centers for Disease Control, which is one of the busiest walk-in low-barrier STI clinics in BC. It closed with people directed to services through a clinic near VGH, but with very difficult access. Their space is now used by a COVID-19 outreach team who are supporting people that are being housed in hotels. We provide information and referral services, responding to over 20,000 inquiries each year. Our reach is province-wide. It is largely staffed by volunteers, many of whom live with chronic health conditions that have precluded their work during the first phase of the pandemic. Our volume of work has dropped considerably. We're planning for their gradual return while our volunteer coordinator manages incoming calls. Our seniors programming includes drop-in services and a friendly visitors program. In 2018, over 300 participants attended events, and we delivered 745 friendly visitor hours. Today, we contact senior clients by telephone and email, work with other seniors organizations, and have reached out to residents and staff of long-term care centers such as Harrow Park, where some members of our community live. We have adopted virtual programming, including a new advisory committee, weekly Zoom socials, and a new writers group. We're working on developing seniors networks in each of the 4 health regions in BC. We are learning that isolation results from a variety of factors and that virtual connection will need to remain in our programming beyond the pandemic. Our youth programming has also moved to phone, email, Zoom, and Facebook contact. 2018, we hosted over 1,000 drop-in participants, over 400 at youth events, and provided over 160 gender-affirming garments to youth across BC with support from Transcare BC. We hear concerns about isolation, youth feeling trapped in unsupported home environments, and the loss of social gatherings. We deliver a low-cost clinical mental health and wellness service delivered by 3 private practice counselors and supported by a staff social worker. They now meet clients by telephone and video conferencing. We were funded by the Vancouver Foundation to offer additional free counseling to everyone as part of our COVID-19 plan, and the counselors now have full calendars. Our education and training group offers queer competency training to businesses and nonprofits and Pride Speaks, which are school-based workshops. They are using this time to develop online programming and update educational materials. We are making stronger use of our website and social media to both promote services and keep our community connected. We recently hosted our first virtual telethon variety program, intended partly to raise some money and mostly connect with the community. It was successful, and we will do more. We will do our best as well to support the Pride Society and our other community partners as they too go virtual. All of the major community events in the queer community are canceled because of the pandemic. We host a large number of peer support groups. All in-person meetings are closed, and many now hold Zoom meetings. And it appears that some will continue with that model even after reopening in-person meetings. It's been noteworthy that our youth and senior services are government funded and are included in what the BC government has determined to be essential social services. That is, we were asked to adapt and continue service delivery as best we can. It's important, first, because we could keep supporting people at this very difficult time, and second, because it signals that the BC government understands the importance of our work. What now? Our first reopening phase starts next week, with more of us working part-time at the office while continuing to work remotely and paving the way for information and referral volunteers to return. Staff report considerable worry about the safety of public transit, which of course most of us rely on. It will take several months before full in-person operations resume. We're heading towards a new 5-year plan. The pandemic has added questions about our programming and services. What lessons are we learning about virtual programming that should be incorporated into ongoing services? How best do we support individuals and local groups in communities throughout BC, particularly those who, for many reasons, are very isolated? How do we offer better support and resources to the parts of our community that need it? For 40 years, we've been resilient, and we continue to adapt to the challenges. And I thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tim. We'll now move on to Katherine Scott, who is connected with the nonprofit that I truly support. So Katherine is a senior researcher with CCPA, which is based in Ottawa and chapters in many different cities across Canada. And as a senior researcher there, she's also served as director for the CCPA's gender equality and public policy work, and has worked in the community sector as a researcher, writer, and advocate for the past 25 years, and has written on a range of issues from social policy to inequality to funding for nonprofits, and most recently about the gendered impacts of COVID. So take it away, Katherine.
Thanks so much, Nora. Is that coming up? Hello, everyone. I'm going to try to share my screen in just a second. Let's see, is this going to work? All right. Wait a minute. So, hang on. Okay. All right, hang on. Sorry about this. Okay. There we go. Hope that's all right. Everyone can see that? Excellent. My name is Katherine Scott, and I thank you for that kind introduction. I'm talking or calling in from Ottawa, which are the unceded traditional territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples in this larger region. As Nora noted, I'm with the CCPA, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and we're a research shop with a couple of offices, several offices across the country, including a wonderful office in Vancouver, our British Columbia office. And so shout out to my colleagues there. I hope you've had a chance to follow some of their research. All of the researchers currently at the CCPA, of course, are turning our shoulder to the wheel and looking at the crisis that we're currently in, understanding what its impact is, trying to ensure that in our immediate response that we are centering the experiences of the most marginalized, and ensuring that the policies and programs that are being introduced capture and support those people, as well as what we need to be doing to make sure that as we pivot out of this moment, as Kim was talking about, that we move to certainly a more gender just, equitable society. This is a moment to do that, and it's incumbent upon us, certainly as in a research community, to contribute to that discussion and to lead that discussion. So that's the important work we're moving forward with. And I've really enjoyed the conversation. This is several different perspectives. I will acknowledge that I'm, CCPA is involved in quantitative research, so slightly bit of a different focus here. What I'm going to do is look at the economic impact. I've been doing some analysis certainly on the how this recession, and then we of course are in a recession, is unwinding with the government closure of large sectors of our economy, and how that is impacting women. Certainly in the past, in past recessions, women would have flooded into the service sector jobs to try to stabilize family incomes. Typically, family incomes that were devastated with the loss of male employment in goods-producing sectors, or in BC, in forestry and the like. But of course, this time around, with the shutdown of broad swaths of the service sector, that won't be a strategy. And I think there's some profound questions right now, and certainly this is what we're trying to wrap our heads around, that, as we ease and hopefully as the economies start to open up, will women even have jobs to return to? And because certainly many of the businesses and nonprofits, many will not be able to weather this economic storm. For others, it'll take years to adapt to this post-COVID world. And so there are really profound questions, I think, facing women and others who identify. And clearly, and hopefully we can chat about this at the conclusion in the questions, that without accessible, affordable childcare on offer and other housing and health supports, it's a question as to whether women will even have the choice about re-entering the labor market. Great numbers who may well be pushed out of the labor market, and what that means for gender equality and women's economic security going forward. And the situation, of course, will be most dire for those who were most vulnerable going into this recession and going into the crisis. That is Indigenous women, women with disabilities, those with chronic health challenges, racialized women, those with precarious immigration status. These are precisely the people that will be are most vulnerable, and certainly our research shows are being most impacted. I'd like also to say, before I throw up some slides, is that, our information about what's going on at this current moment is certainly not adequate in any way, shape, or form. That we have information from important sources like labor market survey and the like, which does not actually present information in the grain and the granularity that we would need, does not present information about racialized communities, Indigenous communities, those with disabilities. And so it's like flying blind. And so that's why it's so critically important to sort of balance these perspectives, to draw research and knowledge from people doing on-the-ground work, like many of the folks on this panel, and certainly many probably in the audience, that really we're going to have to bring all talents to bear to understand this so that we can work our way through. I'm hoping this, there we go. So I'm just going to highlight a few trends, and then sort of set up a conversation about what hopefully we'll be looking for by way of a feminist or an intersectional COVID recovery plan. So as we've already noted, women are on the front lines of this crisis. Certainly over half of all workers, as we see here, 56% of all female women are employed in occupations involving the 5 C's. That is caring, clerical, catering, cashiering, and cleaning. And these are precisely the types of jobs that are directly involved in containing the pandemic and providing needed care and support. In this chart, you'll also see, certainly these are a selection of the different types of professions that are on the front lines right now, overwhelmingly female. I've also included, based on the last census, the proportion of these jobs where we find racialized women, and many of these as well, racialized women are disproportionately represented in these occupations. As you see, home support workers and housekeepers and the like, kitchen helpers, those working in kitchens, providing food for takeout, mail and postal workers. These are disproportionately areas where we find women, racialized women. And here we are. As well, many of these jobs, women's jobs, carry high risk of exposure to the infection itself, as well as high risk of exposure to others, physical proximity to others. These, of course, are jobs that often are least likely to offer important protections, such as paid sickness leave or other health benefits. The CCPA's own research shows that only 19% of workers in accommodation and food services, for instance, or 37% of retail workers had access to paid leave in 2019. And those at greatest risk, in terms of risk of exposure and working in high proximity occupations, are those who earn the least. In February 2020, 43% of workers making $14 an hour or less were at high risk of exposure, as compared to only 11% of those in the top earning decile making over $48 per hour. There's an extraordinary difference here. And these employees, the employees that most are high risk, are more likely to be women. This table here, for instance, if you look on my left-hand side, hopefully your left-hand side, will show you that fully 1/3 of all women are working in high-risk jobs. That's 34%. That's more than twice the rate of men. The large majority in sense of these jobs and personal support workers or home care, home child care providers, cashiers, and the like. These are high-risk jobs. And these are precisely the group of workers, these in high-risk occupations, that are facing the most daunting choice coming forward as the economies open up. Many more women will be wondering whether they can face a choice between moving forward, face the choice to go back to work and the risk to their health and the health of their families that represents, or going without income. This is a really critical, this critical issue that we're facing right now, and particularly acute for women. This is a quick slide, certainly looking at the scale and the economic loss that we're experiencing at this time. Between February and March, Canada's employment dropped by 1 million, with women accounting for 2/3 of these initial losses. And among workers in the core demographic, that's between 25 and 54, women experienced 70% of all job losses. In April, when StatsCan refreshed the numbers, we broke a record. There was all told more than 3 million Canadians who had lost their jobs, and another 2.5 million who'd lost more than a majority of their hours. As some of the construction and manufacturing plants shut down in April, we saw the number of unemployed men go up. So as a result, by the end of April, 32% of women had lost their jobs or a majority of their hours compared, and 29% of men. We expect that certainly with the May numbers, we're probably going to see that starting to open up again as construction sites have gone back. That's certainly true in Ontario. They've been closed down. And again, these male-dominated sectors will be coming on stream more quickly. But that's an extraordinary level of economic hardship. And of course, the employment losses have been greatest among those who are the most vulnerable. And these are the people employed in precarious jobs. The breakdown here in this table shows the breakdown of job loss and I guess hours lost by earnings decile. And we see, if you look right over at the left of the screen, that actually 58%, that's extraordinary, 58% of those people earning $14 or less have been laid off or lost the majority of their hours, as compared at the top to only 1% of those within jobs in the top earnings decile. And we know that this group is overwhelmingly female, and we know that it's overwhelming and it's highly racialized. So well over half of all women in the lowest earning decile lost their jobs between February and April. Again, as compared to a still high 45% of men. I forgot the data point for men. So, you know, this is the shape of this pandemic or the recession is quite significant, certainly on women. It is hitting low-wage workers really hard in particular sectors of the economy. It's hitting, which have historically been a large source of employment for women, and we're seeing that in these figures as it rolls out. The other piece that's really important, and I know I'm conscious of the time, is what's going on for families. And we were talking earlier a bit about childcare. In February, we knew there were roughly 4.6 million parents out there with kids under 12. So kids or parents or families that were obviously where childcare was a critical issue. By April, about 3/4 of this group were still employed, but 1.2 million had lost their jobs or lost the majority of their hours. And what this chart shows is that actually single parents have been disproportionately impacted by job losses and hours lost among parents themselves. And it's a little mind-boggling to think that not only the single parents who are actually still employed, who are juggling with no childcare and the school is closed, childcare is closed. But again, and then there's another large group of obviously lone parents who've lost their jobs and are wondering how on earth they can go back to their employment if it's still available with no support. It's a really critical issue, and it's impacting huge numbers of people, hundreds of thousands of people and parents in Canada. The other piece, and I'll just mention quickly before, hopefully we can pick up some of the conversation in the questions, is that we're also starting to see the number of women are being pushed out of the labor market altogether. So between February and April, we've seen a huge rise in the number of women who are not in the labor market. So those are people who don't report being unemployed, not reporting being laid off. These are people who have left the employment, left the labor market. That figure among women in the core age working groups risen by 34%. And that's a really important number to keep a track of, because, will these women or people come back to employment given the dire sort of local situation, dire labor markets? Will this end up, turning back the clock on economic equality for women? Like the impact we'll start to see a widening employment gap between women and men. We'll also start to see a widening earnings gap, because obviously, as women have been pushed out of the labor market, even in families, that's 40% of income. The figures, we don't have the data yet on what poverty and family income is looking like. We can fully predict that it's dire, and that many households are hanging by a thread right now. Increasing levels of debt to try to get by, notwithstanding the important income support that's on offer, but it will be a crisis situation as we move into June, and where the government will go by way of support, and where we'll go in the long term to try to remedy and build a much, to repair the glaring gaps in our social safety net that have been really laid bare at this point. So I will leave it there. Happy to share my information and research, and again, maybe we can circle back and talk about some of the directions we're looking to going forward. And I think that's good. There we go.
Yeah, thank you, Katherine. I think you have given us real hard evidence to support the claims being made in media and our politicians, and why women and racialized people of color, including immigrants, have been most affected by this pandemic in the labor sector in particular. So we now move on to our final member of the panel, someone who I was told is a must-meet person when I first came to Vancouver more than 20 years ago. Welcome, Ellen Woodsworth. Ellen is known to us as a former councillor here in the city of Vancouver. And some of you might also know that she is an internationally known speaker on gender and urban issues from intersectional lens. As founder and co-chair of WTC, or Women Transforming Cities International Society. Ellen is a member of the National Committee Advancing Equity and Inclusion, a guide for municipalities, and coordinates the Women Transforming Cities Hot Pink paper municipal campaign in order to create women-friendly cities, in addition to other advocacy work that she's doing, particularly in light of the COVID-19 recovery strategy and the budget. So welcome, Ellen. Take it away.
I have to say that as soon as I heard about Leonora De Angelis and her work, I knew she was the one that I had to meet. And it's a pleasure to meet with an academic who's also an activist and really pays attention to grassroots organizing here and around the world. And I'm happy to join Gayleen and the people who organized today's webinar. And it's really exciting to be working with all these incredible research writers, academics, activists who we need right at this moment. This is an absolutely critical turning point for women all over the world. I was on a session with UN Women this morning from 4:30 on and tomorrow morning, looking at inclusive cities with a gendered perspective. So I will be posting their work, whether it's Safety Pin or Woerd Commission, some of the work in Latin America that Ana Falou is doing, some of the work our African sisters are doing. There are amazing things happening all over the world. And one of the more exciting things that I finally got my hands on and I'm going to post is that Hawaii has just finally launched their Hawaiian recovery plan called Building Bridges, Not Walking on Backs, a feminist economic recovery plan for COVID-19, which actually uses gendered intersectional frameworks, talks about disaggregated data. Is dynamite. And this is exactly what we need. We're at a critical point right now that if we don't fight our very hardest, no longer shoulder to shoulder, but linked arms locally and globally, women's rights are going to go back so quickly, because the corporations and the military industrial complex, the fossil fuel companies, not only are destroying people's lives at Wet'suwet'en with their mountain pipelines, but all over the world, they're moving in to control our lives and to make further massive profits. I heard Jimmy Pattison wealth just increased 200 million in the last few months. But there is the money. Our money is with the federal governments, the provincial governments, and a little bit at the city level of governments. So it's not a question of whether there's money to do the things we need to have good lives. There is the money. We could have a feminist New Green Deal with Indigenous women at the lead. We could implement the Murdered and Missing Women's Inquiry now, but we're going to have to fight hard to do that. We have to demand that women, self-identified women in all our broad diversities, are at the recovery tables, which have already been formed by the federal, provincial, and city governments. We have to say that the leadership of the women's movement, and by women I mean self-identified women, trans women, two-spirit women, lesbian, bi, anyone who self-identifies as a woman, and is in a leadership position in women's organizations like Kim, we have to be at those tables, because the fault lines that we're experiencing and that Katherine talked about so eloquently, we're living. So we can see what needs to be done. It's not a matter of patching them over. We need to excavate them, and we need to build something that actually works for us and addresses our tremendous workload of unpaid work, the huge increases of unpaid work in the home, the huge increases of racism that are being experienced around the world, and the increases of violence against the LGBTQI2S communities. And there are people working on these issues. And I post regularly on the Women Transforming Cities website. So the Outright or the Dignity posts calling for action on the violence against I2S peoples around the world it's really important to read that, to find out what's happening in Africa, what's happened in Hungary, Poland, where they're boasting on the eliminating our communities in various province by province, as they wipe us out and murder us. I'm an out lesbian feminist, active for a long time. My partner is of Japanese origin. So we live intersectional lives. Most of us live some kind of multiple intersectional lives, and we need to be speaking out in broad intersectional coalitions and calling for that feminist Green New Deal, because that's exactly what happened after World War II in the United States. They turned the economies back to the people and created the jobs. We could create green jobs, not give the money to the fossil fuel companies, who actually had 29 meetings with the federal government offices over a 2-week period. We have to be at their offices at least that amount of time. And we're part of a coalition called Feminists Deliver. We're writing a letter to the provincial government, and we've been in conversations with them saying we want to be at the reconstruction table, because we're not, but those people are at the reconstruction table. Yesterday, I worked with Councillor Jean Swanson, and I said, look, what's this budget the staff are presenting to you yesterday, as they talked about the COVID recovery. What had been put on hold was the gender equity plan, was the work around the murdered and missing inquiry, was anti-racist work, was work in the downtown east side. All kinds of things have been put on hold, and the staff were proposing that they continue to stay on hold until after COVID-19. Does any of us know when that's going to be, or the next one comes? Why would the gender equity work, the anti-racist work, the support for Indigenous women and girls and all Indigenous people in the city of Vancouver, the site of the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and the Picton farm victims, why would you take those staff to move them into that frontline work? Why wouldn't you keep that equity staff working and hire more staff, or hire people from the downtown east side to work with their own people? I mean, so that's why we have to be at the table, because we live it, we see it, we know the implications of it on our families, on our friends, and we know that we cannot be lost in the reconstruction, or it's going to be not only the same old normal, but it's going to be even further back, because we will have lost so many paid jobs, part-time, full-time, and that's particularly impacting Indigenous women and girls, immigrant women and girls, diverse peoples of all cultures are. When you put the combination of gender, race, sexuality together, they're the most vulnerable and most hit, and the implications long-term about as violence, racist violence, domestic violence, queer violence will be even worse, because we don't have the money and we don't have the affordable housing to get out of those violent situations. And Battered Women Support Services, ATIRA, other nonprofit organizations are working 24-hour, desperate, even for socks to help people with, because of course sex trade workers can't declare their earnings and they don't have any work right now, and they're in a huge crisis, and the agencies that work with them like WISH are in a crisis as well. So this is why we have to join other organizations and make that call to be at the recovery tables. I'm going to post a number of these things are already up on either my personal website or Women Transforming Cities website, so that you can share them, and they're great tools. There's a new international coalition called Just Recovery for All. There have been incredibly powerful coalitions that have written to the Prime Minister. If you go on the Canadian Women's Foundation website, they've got some of that information up there. And we're going to have a conference on October 4th that's going to talk about some of these issues and how do we address systemic barriers to women's participation in local government. Because probably within the year there'll be a provincial election, a federal election, and then in 2022 there will be a municipal election. We need to support diverse women to step up and get organized, join parties, and run for elected office, so we don't go back to where we are now, that people think they can take off the gendered intersectional lens because we're in the crisis, rather than to apply it even more deeply because we're in the crisis and we can actually see the implications of what's happening. Oh, somebody's put it up for me. Okay, building bridges, not walking on backs. It's in the chat line. So you've got it right there. It's very exciting. And go to the Outlook site, go to Dignity if you want to see some queer statements about the pandemic. And let's see, my cat really wants to play with me. So I'm having a little battle here with my cat. So I also want to say, as an example, yesterday, because Women Transforming Cities really has fought to get the city of Vancouver to put a gendered intersectional lens, and they did May 29th last year doing Feminist Deliver and Women Deliver. They put a amendment moved by Jean Swanson to put a gendered intersectional lens, measurable and supported on all departments for 6 years, which is what the UN says it takes to turn a big institution around. But you know, if you're not paying attention to city council, sometimes it might be staff, it might be the elected, they don't put that on, and you have to be watching them. So yesterday, when we started to see the staff was going to try to not implement the gendered intersectional lens right now, put it off to God knows when, they weren't going to hire the diversity and inclusion staff person, even though they were almost completed the hiring process. So we started texting, I started sending emails to all the counselors about the Hawaiian recommendations, about a lot of other things that's happening, and just letting them know we're watching and that we want them to stand up. And we worked with Jean Swanson and her assistant, and she moved a motion right at the end asking staff to find the money to fund this work. And it was just like this turnaround, talking about gender, talking about racism, and them knowing that the public was watching them, even though we can go and speak in council, but there's no council there. It's all online. You don't even get to see them. But because we were emailing them and putting that pressure on, that motion passed unanimously, and we saved a huge setback to gendered intersectional movement within the city, which will mean funding that wasn't going to be there for Hogan's Alley, for all kinds of different issues. So I urge you to pay attention to what governments are doing, pay attention to at all levels of government, and think seriously whether you could be part of a campaign to help a woman who has that gender intersectional lens, who's diverse, who wants to run, is able to run. Get behind that person now and start building those campaigns. We're in for the long haul. We have nothing left but to fight, because we do not plan to go backwards. So this webinar is really important. There's lots of other ones. Arundhati Roy was talking with Naomi Klein the other day. Vandana Shiva was talking with David Suzuki. They're all online. They're very, very, very important new understandings of what kind of world we want, and that we don't want to give it to the fossil fuel companies. We don't want to give it to the Amazons. We don't want to give it to the billionaires. That's our money, it's our taxes, and we want the governments to spend it for social programs, affordable housing, free public transit, childcare 24/7 a day for the emergency workers and anybody who needs it, men and women. We need those kind of public social structures, not the privatization of healthcare, the privatization of prisons, the privatization of pensions, which is what they're planning to do if we're not active, if we're not walking arm in arm together on this.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ellen. We now move on to the Q&A portion, and I have now my list of questions, which I will stack together for our panelists to answer. So for all of you, I'd like you to end our webinar with your answer to 2 questions that are at the top of the list. So the first question for you all is from Maftab. How can local grassroots organizations effectively engage in community-based data collection to bridge the data divide on gender plus issues? So how can we be all, citizen researchers at this time? And corollary to that is a question for all. that from your work, could you please tell us more about what remains invisible to the wider public, given that COVID-19 is often seen to have surfaced a lot of things that remain previously invisible? And what structurally does not allow those experiences to be known or to be heard? What would be the pros and cons of this visibility? And what types of vulnerabilities could this novel visibility status attenuate, create, or perpetuate? So that's a question for all of you, which I'd like you to devote some time thinking while I pose a question, or maybe two, for Kim. Kim, you have here a question from Judith. So many talk about the environmental benefits of this pandemic, and a lot of people feel more connected to nature. So how do Indigenous people feel more connected to nature as they approach this topic of, I guess, pandemic environment connection? Have this kind of connection become stronger? And would this be a time, you think, for a broader acknowledgement of Indigenous ways of learning, of knowing and living? Okay. So, Kim, would you like to answer that quickly?
Well, I can try, and I don't know that it would be a quick response because it is very nuanced. And I think the interesting thing is like just making, the first thing that pops up into my mind is the notion that all Indigenous people are connected to nature. And I think because of the colonial history that we have, so many of us have been taken away from that connection. And I think it's very complicated and I don't think that's what you're saying, but I think that's one thing I'd like to point out. But I undoubtedly think that it's the time to make space for Indigenous ways of knowing and learning. I think we've been so long immersed in a positivist perspective in academia and beyond that that has a very Western concept of what reality is and what knowledge is. And I think if we find ways in our communities and the work that we do to uphold Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing and recognize even that sort of self-assessment of when you're bringing in the notion of white supremacy into your thinking is hugely beneficial, and there's no better time than right now to do that.
Thank you, Kim. Katherine, this is a question from Judith directed to you regarding your comment on, will women have jobs to even come back to? And it's like, you know, what happened during the war. And if we think of this war as, you know, of this pandemic as similar to a war, that it seems so easy to revert to conservative family models. Women doing most of the hard work, the house and care work at home, moving away from the workforce. And she asks, what does that say about a society that supposedly cares about equality and which concrete structural changes are necessary? In your opinion, how can we establish and reestablish economic equality going forward? Katherine.
No, that's a great question. And it's a profoundly troubling aspect of this current crisis that has been borne so largely by low-income, racialized, marginalized women, that, you know, there's two pieces. One is when I say, will there be jobs to come back to? I think we can, women who are largely employed in certain service sectors that have high levels of proximity to other people, will those jobs come back? Whatever, it speaks to the quality of employment, simply sectors. I mean, the transition, it's hard looking forward to the future of our economy. Where will job creation go? Might be an opportunity. There is an opportunity there, but I think there's a real challenge, like just numerically, will these jobs come back anytime soon? And the other piece of that is, with caring responsibilities, the schools, childcare, people's concerns about moving, certainly taking public transit, as Tim was talking about, will families or will women feel comfortable going back to work, and will they have caring, and do they have the care and support that would allow them to do that? Because certainly that's an issue right now. And actually, it's some of the interesting work that's coming out of the UK and the like are just saying, how what's happened is, where it might be an opportunity to rebalance caring responsibilities. In fact, in women's unpaid work is going up exponentially and is not doing so much among men. So that gap, the unpaid burden or the division of labor in the home is actually becoming more traditional in real time as we are going through this crisis. And in that sort of instance, when you're looking at that and families make decisions saying who will go back into paid employment, it may well be that women will end up staying home because there are no caring supports. And the solution really must be that we invest in Canada's caring economy. Like, the solution has to be all of the things that Ellen was talking about creating a social infrastructure that supports individuals, families, and communities to thrive, that invests in decent jobs in the care sector and the like. There really are, like, in terms of childcare, seniors care, the range, supports for people with chronic health problems. We really have to pay attention to this. That's been a huge blind spot. Moving forward, that's really, I think, one of the only strategies, and hopefully we'll double down, that would actually pretend some kind of positive developments coming out of this crisis.
Thank you, Katherine. We have about 10 minutes left, and I have here a few questions. I will stack 3 political questions for Ellen. Ellen, anonymous attendees have asked 3 questions that I think you could answer best. One is about the case, and I'm very familiar with this case, and I won't mention the name, of a Filipina union organizer that was recently featured in a CBC segment. And during the interview, she discussed the limitations of the CERB for working racialized women. And in turn, she has been subjected to attacks, cyberbullying, who framed her as ungrateful. So the question is, how do we normalize criticisms of the provincial and federal government's aid, especially since these aren't long-term solutions, while protecting people like this union leader who are bringing issues to our attention? 2 related questions also have to deal with politics. How can privileged people become good allies for communities who need support at this time? And I am reminded of this question by a post in Foreign Policy. And one of the silver linings, according to the writer of this pandemic, is, repeat after me, women are better at politics. And we have seen how in countries that are led by women leaders, they have passed more bold legislation for increased services and subsidies. And the question is, in your assessment, to what extent have we seen this in BC? So Ellen, in a minute or 2.
Why aren't you answering the first question? Seriously, I think you should answer it. I mean, I'll just say right away.
I'll add after you.
Okay, the way we treat immigrants in this country is despicable, it's racist, and it's gendered. It's harder for women to get into Canada. Workers are coming here from the Philippines, and they, in the privatization of our long-term care facilities, they were being forced to work 3 jobs to make a fair wage. They were running from job to job to job. Now, temporarily, the provincial government has taken over the management of the workers, so they now are, they have an 8-hour day job or supplemental wages at one institution. Public long-term care needs to be brought into the public sector is the solution to that. So all workers can have a decent wage in a full-time job, but also those workers should have the right to be Canadian citizens, not be held in limbo in these jobs and also in working in private people's homes or doing home care. It's abominable what happens to immigrant workers in this country. And you can go into the depth about that, the attack on that woman, but that's you know, the courage it takes for that woman to speak out, and the dangerous situation it puts her in terms of her immigrant status needs to be, you talk about what a privileged person can do. A privileged person can expose this, protecting the woman who's in that situation. A privileged person can give donations to the Kalayan Center, can give donations to domestic workers organizations, could give donations to organizations that are, you know, like PovNet, West Coast Leaf, Feminist Deliver, Wish. There's so many organizations that need money. If you've got money and you know, you can see these people doing incredible work, please donate. This donation can make such a difference. The Wet'suwet'en people, Rita Wong is gathering money to send up to the Wet'suwet'en. Kim, you can help me. There was a structure there that people, the elders and the matriarchs were taking care of, that was destroyed. It was attacked by some white supremacists. The rise of the alt-right and white supremacists in Canada is very dangerous. There's one of them's on the board of the Nonpartisan Association, the provincial organization. Another one was Doug Kerr, who's Premier of Ontario. He was his communication manager. They've worked on federal campaigns. We need to be organized and expose these people, but we need to get funding to progressive organizations to help them organize to stand up, like Lead Now, Dogwood. There's many different, you know, national organizations. So there's lots privileged allies could do. Women better at politics. It's an equality right that women run for elected office. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a lot more progressive. What we need is equity rights. We need to make sure that we have at least 30% of women in all elected bodies to really make a difference. But women do come with that lived experience that we need childcare and we need to address unpaid work. They come with a lived experience of knowing the violence. A woman who runs for elected office, like Rosemary Brown, she comes with experience of incredible racism. We bring to the table, when we run for elected office, the experiences we have. We can be elected to elected office and fight for social good. But some people will, and most men, run for elected office as a career move. We have to elect those people who will fight for the social good of all. Mm-hmm. And this is critical. The women, like the Arden, who's the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Dr. Bonnie Henry, Dr. Tam, the racism Dr. Tam is experiencing. Sorry, I'm jumping around here, but really we do need women in leadership because they have lived the fault lines, they have lived the intersectionality of race, gender identity, and they will be supportive to a different world going forward.
Thank you, Ellen. I'd like now to give a chance to our panelists in about 30 to 40 seconds each to answer the 2 questions that were posed around what other data do we need, what remains to become visible and known and heard at this time, and how can we all, particularly grassroots organization, contribute to data collection and analysis that's so much more needed, as Tim and other members of the panel mentioned. So we'll start with you, Julia.
Sure, thank you. I'll be very brief. In terms of data, one thing the Canadian government is not collecting is data on cases and mortality desegregated by race or ethnicity. And I think this is a real gap, and that's something that community groups can argue for and advocate for, but also begin to collect within their circles and networks in order to demonstrate that this is a data gap that needs to be collected. There's also a lot of demand for better data around interpersonal violence. And there's some examples coming out of South America of groups crowdsourcing that sort of data, of using maps and different ways to collect data around interpersonal violence that I think is quite powerful and could be used by community groups. And in terms of what's invisible, echoing some of what's already been said, I think the violence that people who are non-binary and trans, and especially youth, are experiencing during this crisis is something that's not being covered by the media, which is, you know, almost, I think, sensationalizing the violence towards women in a really distressing way. So I think that's a big gap. And then also just the number of women that are on the front lines, or other, you know, women, I'd say newcomers to Canada, that are on the front lines that are not being recognized for the work they're doing, whether that's childcare workers or others. So that'll be my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Julia. Kim.
Yeah, I think I don't have much more to add. I think the group who is participating in this teach-in maybe have a call to action to bring what the invisible elements are forward, so that they are more visible external to this group.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Tim, if you could speak a little bit too in terms of knowledge or information about push in policy circles for collection of data around LGBTQ individuals and community impacts. Final words, Tim.
Sorry, I had noise in the background that I missed most of what you said, but to be really, really brief, I would be asking for stronger partnerships between community organizations like ours and researchers. We have limited expertise and less capacity to be engaged in research and data collection work. So I think it's a partnership sort of process that we need to build on. With respect to invisibility, I think, and it's not particularly or solely an LGBTQ issue, but the invisibility of people with disabilities, and I guess a particular emphasis on people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, continues to be at the end of a very long list of oversights.
We now move on to Katherine. How do we help the CCPA as we become citizen researchers?
That would be fantastic. There's a huge scope. I'm really struck by all of the amazing work that's being done in communities right now, and local groups, nonprofits that Tim was talking about, actually stepping up and trying to tell community stories. Right now, it's so critically important because there's such just such huge gaps in what we are collecting nationally, even with these new crowdsourced surveys that StatsCan's involved in, and there's huge gaps. I do think community stories are vitally important, and I do think we need to drive research and resources into the nonprofit sector to start telling these stories. You know, a lot of the money is being generated, research set aside in the academic institutions, which doesn't actually always or rarely floats down into communities, and there's a real role that community members can play. And the flip side of that, and I worry about one of the stories, and I completely agree on the people with disabilities in terms of invisibility, but the invisibility about what's going on in the community sector. Like, you know, really, you know, the focus has been initially, as it must be, on making sure the money is flowing, that families are supported. But, you know, those, you know, organizations that aren't getting their contracts renewed by different levels of government, who are running up their own people, their staff that are, you know, against the wall, that these people that, you know, are looking at layoffs, you know, childcares that are closing. Like, there's this massive disconnect between, you know, what's happening on the ground. I think everybody feels like we're in this bubble, and then like the end of the June, it'll like miraculously go back to some form of normalcy. And I just think the community sector has been so sidelined here. And it's really, it's dangerous. And I worry about where we're at with that. And we need to be drawing more attention to the extraordinary work people continue to do, transforming their service and providing support to those who are most vulnerable in all of this.
Katherine, final words from Ellen. What should we make visible, and what remains invisible?
I think what remains invisible is that the Canadian government spends $32 billion of Canadian taxpayers' money on defense, is selling hundreds of millions of dollars of arms to Saudi Arabia. This is our money. We pay taxes. This money could provide us with a national housing program, which we haven't had since 1995 when Paul Martin got rid of it. It could provide us with a national childcare program. It could provide us with creation of new green feminist jobs. Like we could be cleaning up the messes, and I don't think we should, but we could be hiring the workers instead of more fossil fuel development, which is polluting the environment. We could be cleaning up their messes and be growing food that's going to be needed. So the money is there. We have to recognize there is money there. It should be our choice of how that's money spent. And we should make sure that the federal government spends it on the common good. And they won't unless we speak out and join some of these coalitions. We could say the same thing to the provincial government. How do we want our money spent? It is our money that they're spending. Same thing the city, although the city only gets 9 cents of the tax dollar, so it's more difficult. But if we want these social programs like real affordable housing, you know, seniors care in a public sector, not a private sector, whether we want schooling to be affordable to people, we want the 75% of Indigenous people who are access the friendship centers. Leslie Varley said that the friendship centers, there's I think 42 across Canada, they're not getting any funding. You know, there's very basic social needs that are not being met. There's money to meet them, and we have to raise our voices up and speak and get our organizations to speak about the kind of life we want to live and how we want our money spent.
Okay. Thank you to all our panelists and for all our attendees, especially those who sent in their questions. This is a reminder that we have a recorded version of this webinar, which will be sent to you and which you can post in all your social media channels. So with this, we'd like to say goodbye and remind you that the Gender Plus Research Collective will have a next webinar in June. So stay tuned. Thank you so much to our hosts, Gayleen, Tina, and others on the group. And we look forward to seeing you in our next webinar. Warm regards to all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.